So, this afternoon, I'd like to talk about doing what we feel like.
Going to the toilet.
So that can sound on the surface like selfish or irresponsible. What it means is doing what you feel like rather than doing what your head says you should or shouldn't do. And so on the surface, once again, someone says, well, if I do what I feel like instead of what my head says I should or shouldn't do, then I'm going to be selfish and irresponsible. And that turns out to not at all be the case, unless it's the case. But what it means is it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be selfish and irresponsible because you're working from a place of feeling. The mind that believes that we act a certain way because of what the mind says, so the mind that thinks it is the doer in control of everything, it thinks that it controls our behavior. And so to the mind, the idea that the body isn't going to follow the thinking mind, the doer, to that aspect, the assumption is, well, in that case, anything can happen. Actually, life has always been happening this way. Life has always been a functioning whereby the body is moving according to its genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the thinking mind is a particular type of up-to-date conditioning that exists in the form of a belief that I, some entity which exists within the belief, I am the doer. So there isn't actually an entity, a real entity. There is a thought, a belief that arises that says, I am the doer. The doer is a thought. There never has been a doer that goes out and does things. There's the thought, the belief that there is a doer that goes out and does things. And when this thought dissolves, the thinking mind essentially dissolves, and the rest of the human being remains. So the rest of the human being, meaning the working mind and the body, continues to be there and functions as it always has, based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning. So when the thinking mind falls away, we suddenly don't act radically differently to the way we did before. Our preferences are more or less the same. Our temperament remains more or less the same. We still have our good points and our shortcomings. We may still be irritable, if that's part of our biological makeup. We may still be quiet in nature, if that's part of our biological nature or biological makeup. And if we're particularly social as part of our biological makeup, then we'd still remain fairly social. If we had certain ways of doing work, those ways of doing work won't necessarily change when the thinking mind falls away. What changes is this attitude to the flow of life that used to be there, that was continually judging what happened as right or wrong, continually judging life as an attack or an addition on to who I believe myself to be. Looking to the future for what we believe will be happiness in the future. So what falls away is a whole layer of attitudinal reactions, what we can call the psychological reactions. The biological reactions continue to happen in life. And included in the biological reactions are some reactions that we might hope come to an end, but in fact don't. Biological reactions that are painful, like anger, can still arise. If circumstance is such that the biological makeup is triggered and anger arises, then that will still happen. Our attitude to anger arising will change radically if the thinking mind is no longer there. The attitude towards anger when the thinking mind is there is the thinking mind believing it is the doer. It says, I created this anger. I shouldn't get angry. It says that because anger is pain, and the automatic psychological reaction that happens with the biological reaction of anger is to be attached to life being pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. The pain arises, and so there is a resistance and uncomfortableness with the pain that we can call as the primary suffering. So instead of just anger arising, we have anger plus a resistance to the anger. And then a resistance in the sense, a resistance to the pain, because anger will be pain, not pleasure, as opposed to if we hear a joke and we start laughing at the joke, we find it funny. That's a biological reaction, and it's pleasure instead of anger, which is pain. So to the extent that there is an attachment to pain not being present, when anger arises, there will be a resistance to the pain, which is going to be pain plus this attachment to outcome. And then the doer says, you shouldn't be resisting. You shouldn't be getting angry, and you shouldn't be resisting this anger. It can be an extra layer of guilt or blame towards the other that maybe did something that created the reaction of anger. So this is just a description of how the thinking mind relates to whatever happens in the flow of life, how the thinking mind relates to the biological reaction of pain, the biological reaction of anger, which is pain. Not physical pain, but pain because it's not necessarily the emotion that is in line with our preferences. So when the thinking mind falls away, sadness and anger, which are biological reactions that are on the painful side, may still happen. And sometimes we have an expectation that that won't happen, that the expectation is that this process of liberation is a process whereby pain somehow stops happening. And anger can be classified as, or we can intellectually assume, we can have an expectation that anger no longer happens. And because we have developed with this idea that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 then a set of beliefs was put in place about what I should and shouldn't do in each moment. Like in this situation, I should do this. Our parents started, along with all the other conditioning that we received, our parents said, in this situation, this is how you should behave. And if we behave differently, we would get in trouble, pain in the moment. And because the belief had already set in place that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, then we start to form a strategy of how I should and shouldn't act. And to the extent that we start realizing that my happiness is not to be found in pleasure. Pleasure is pleasure. Pleasure is much nicer than pain. But if we think that this nicer pleasure is actually my happiness, then the error is in place. And so when we start realizing that my happiness is actually more of an allowance than a getting something, it's an attitudinal allowance for life to be the way it is, an attitude that we could call an attitude of the heart. So it's not a mental attitude, it's the attitude of the heart that is allowed to function when the set of beliefs that create the attitude of doership and attachment to outcomes, when they fall away, then this attitude of the heart can function. Now, this attitude of the heart that allows everything to be as it is doesn't get in the way of the biological reaction kicking in when life is not as we would like on a pleasure and pain level. So if we receive some food and we taste the food and it's not hot enough, the acceptance, the attitude of non-doership understands that I'm not the doer, the other isn't the doer. The circumstance is the way it is as part of the story of life, not my doing and not the other's doing. So there is an acceptance that in this moment I receive food that is cold. That acceptance is on the attitudinal level. It doesn't equate to an acceptance on the biological level. Happiness is not an acceptance on the biological level, but an acceptance on the attitudinal level. So when the food is tasted and it's too cold, anger may actually arise. I told the waitress to ensure that my soup is really hot and it's cold, so anger may arise. As long as that anger isn't accompanied by blame, which blame and anger can seem very similar. It's like you're angry at the soup being cold. So doesn't that mean you're blaming the waitress for not having passed on the instruction? So actually, I'm just angry that my soup is cold. I'm angry that I told the waitress and it didn't happen. But attitudinally, if the understanding is that there is no doer, then the blame that is specifically targeted as the waitress, seeing the waitress as a separate independent entity that acts according to her own choice, that won't be there. And so the blame won't arise, and yet you could call over the waitress and you could ask her to take the soup back and have it heated up. So acceptance doesn't mean that on a biological level, the story of life may still turn out in such a way that we do something in order to try and improve the situation. So to have an understanding of the difference between the attitude of acceptance versus the biological movement. And the biological movement is always going to be based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning that make up the biological side of the human being. The attitude is also based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, but the genes and up-to-date conditioning that make up the psychological aspect of the human. So actually the genes are the same genes. The psychological is largely a result of certain up-to-date conditioning, certain belief systems that exist in the body, beliefs about who I am and what I need. And the beliefs that make up the thinking mind are essentially the belief in personal doership, that I am the doer of whatever happens through me, the other is the doer of whatever happens through them, and my outcome is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. When we look at the nature of the human being, not the nature of the human, when we look at the biological instrument, the human being on a biological and psychological level, we can see that the genes and up-to-date conditioning are not something I put in place. So how the body functions on both a psychological and a biological level is a happening according to these factors that are in place, they're undeniable, and not my doing. And at some point we might notice that living life from our head is living life from a set of beliefs of shoulds and shouldn'ts that fit into the thinking mind category, linked very much to where I believe my happiness is to be found. And so if the understanding is going to go deeper and deeper, and it is recognized that when I function, when the body functions in a particular way, it's effectively confirming that these beliefs are true. So every time that there is a movement in life that is inspired by the psychological beliefs about what I need, then that psychological belief is overriding the biological movement. And what happens as a result of that is that there's an uncomfortableness inside. And eventually we start saying, I have to live my life differently. I can't keep functioning this way because it creates this uncomfortableness. And so then we might realize that the shoulds and shouldn'ts are keeping me disconnected from feeling my body. The shoulds and shouldn'ts are keeping me from following what I'm being told on another level by the body. The body might be tired, and so the body is saying on a biological level, I'm tired and I want to go to sleep. And the shoulds and shouldn'ts are saying, you shouldn't go to sleep because that will be a waste of the next 4 hours. And so that shouldn't can keep us from following the feeling that's in the body. Now, the feeling in the body is not limited to just feelings of hunger and tiredness. The feeling in the body also includes aspects, other faculties like intuition, and it can also include a very significant amount of data that comes from the brain. But the data that comes from the brain that becomes part of a feeling of what to do in each moment is not data from the thinking mind, not data that says, this is the only way you can act. This is what you should do. The data I'm talking about that comes from the brain that can become part of feeling is data that assesses the situation and doesn't come up with a firm conclusion. So it sees that there are several options, and it understands what the potential consequences of those options are. So it can look at 3 plane tickets and assess that this plane ticket is really very expensive for, say, the distance that's traveled. Finds another plane ticket that is much cheaper but takes a really long time to get you to the location. And then there's another ticket that is an average price in between the 2 other ones that we're seeing and a reasonable travel time. So it has now assessed the situation. It hasn't come up with an answer that says this is what you should do. That's what the thinking mind will do. It's just seen the circumstance. And then if we allow a feeling to come from the body, feel what do I feel like doing, we'll find that at some point an answer will come, and the answer from the body may not be what seems most logical. The answer from the body might be to take the cheapest ticket because of other factors that come into the decision. The answer might be to take the most expensive ticket because of a sense of intuition, maybe the travel times, those other travel times, something saying don't travel on that day. In this situation, most likely, if the ticket stands out, if one ticket stands out, and it's the right price and the right travel time, then the feeling that comes up is most likely going to be in line with the data that was delivered by the working mind that has assessed the situation. But if we drop the shoulds and shouldn'ts and allow the decision, allow the feeling to arise in the body, and start following that feeling without sticking to just one faculty. So Ramesh also used to say, if you can't look at a situation and make a calculated decision, which means look at it and allow the working mind to assess the situation, then you can even toss a coin. And if you toss a coin, and heads come up, and heads tell you to do, one of 2 options, then that information goes into the system. And the feeling might come up after you've tossed the coin, and the feeling might go, no, do whatever the feeling says. And the more that we can start to trust and experiment, so not really trust, but experiment with living from a place of feeling, what we might find is that an intelligence exists on the level of the biology, an intelligence that has been obscured and blocked by the thinking mind. And what we might imagine will turn out to be really disastrous set of outcomes if we follow this set of feelings can in fact turn out to be much more positive than we think. So in my own case, at some point it became very clear that I had this internal conflict because I was doing what I thought I should do based on the up-to-date conditioning that life had delivered. And when I looked at it and compared it to what I felt like doing, there was a gap. So I would make appointments at times that my head would say this makes sense to make an appointment at this point in time. And then when the time came, the feeling was not necessarily a feeling that wanted to do what the appointment said was on the schedule. But my thinking mind, my shoulds and shouldn'ts, didn't really appreciate that there was an intelligence in the body, and said, well, this is the way you do it. You make appointments and then you do them. That if I cancel, then that's going to lead to an unfortunate outcome. And because the belief is my happiness is to be found in fortunate outcomes, then essentially you say, I can't cancel. My friend won't appreciate that. My client won't be my client. And this is not to say that there won't be consequences. There's always going to be consequences. But what I'm suggesting is that if we experiment, we might find that, one, the consequences are not what we thought, and two, that there's an intelligence that comes from this feeling that also includes an assessment of consequences, but an assessment and an intelligence that is different to the one that's saying this is what I should do. So this is what I mean by we don't necessarily become irresponsible and erratic people just because we're starting to function from a sense of feeling what to do. Is that a question? No. So at first, when we break away from living life a particular way, when we break away from doing what I should do based on an attachment to outcomes, we tend to swing a little bit wildly to the other extreme. Because there's a realization, I've spent my whole life doing what I should do. And in fact, in each moment, I have a full range of options. If only I suspend the shoulds and shouldn'ts. And so there can be a sort of rebellion against shoulds and shouldn'ts for a while, where an intelligence is actually not allowed to flow straight away, because this rebellion swings us a little bit onto the other side of the spectrum. That, in a sense, I think is necessary. It's just something that maybe we have to live with for a while. And if we choose, well, that doesn't sound very good, it means that we get stuck in the standard way of living. And that, from our own experience, delivers an uncomfortableness that at some point gets great enough that we start surrendering and saying, I have to live life differently. I've done it like this for long enough. So then it doesn't seem like there's any other option but to start following this feeling, doing things a bit differently, honoring a feeling that has been talking to us for a long time, a feeling that's been saying, maybe you should go down this direction in life, but the shoulds and shouldn'ts took us down this direction. And so the further down that direction we go, the bigger the divergence can be, and the bigger the divergence, the more uncomfortable we feel. So correcting that divergence can also have its challenges, because we might need to find ourselves deconstructing a life that has been put in place from a certain way of seeing life. If we start gently, if we start doing what we feel like in certain areas where we feel, okay, the consequence is not going to be terrible, that we might find that the results are worthwhile. And as we do that and get worthwhile results, then maybe there's a bit more trust in this shift from doing what I think I should do, all of the do's and don'ts, all of the shoulds and shouldn'ts. And we start maybe experimenting with some bigger decisions.
Sorry, I'm asking a lot of questions, but oh well. Because this is almost like, I was meant to be doing something this afternoon and I cancelled because I really wanted to hear what you were going to say about this. So there was a real strong sense that I should be who's teaching meditation, actually, but they'll be fine. Better off without me teaching them meditation, probably. Over the last few years, I've allowed myself to go online and read newspapers. I just allowed this thing to, and I know a lot about world events as a result. And recently, there's just been a sense that I have to try to put that down, because it's just, there is a gnawing sense in the body that this isn't at all satisfying. And so I've been putting that down. And there isn't much, I've got fairly fortunate circumstances. I don't have to go out and work if I don't want to. So there's a lot of space. And there's, I was just sitting there the other day and, well, I could do the dishes, I suppose. But I am trying to just be quiet and listen and sense this thing. And at this point, there is an awareness that I don't want to go towards reading newspapers online or do that kind of stuff. It feels addictive and very mental. So there is stuff that intuitively I know is wrong or isn't good for me. It's not a should from outside. There's a sense of it inside. Mm-hmm. So I don't quite know what my question is, but it's about listening to that voice and following it.
Yeah. So I guess I can carry on and with that in the mix, and we'll include that. So it's important for us not to look at what has been happening and think it was my doing as a doer. It's part of the story of life. So the fact that in a particular moment you get online and read the newspapers, hopefully is seen as a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, both your biological and your psychological makeup. And understood that in this moment, I'm in front of the computer and I'm reading or I'm questioning whether I should or shouldn't go online. And that is destiny in this moment. That is the story of life in this moment, and it couldn't be any different based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And if the urge to go online is strong enough that it forces you to go online, then hopefully this is recognized also as being what is destined in that moment. So the overall attitude is that even when I'm functioning from a place of shoulds or shouldn'ts or attachment to outcomes, or doing something that is an addiction, let's say, to cover up a deeper uncomfortableness, hopefully the attitude is even this is a happening. To the extent that we start to feel, like you're describing, that actually this is not intuitively, there's a knowing that this is part of the thinking mind. It's part of the dynamic of doership and attachment to outcome. And so that's when the working mind, with that experience that tells it this is not ideal, it is what it is in that moment. So to judge it is also going to be a problem. But when the working mind starts seeing, I could do something differently, I can make decisions from a different place, that's when things start to change. So at some point it became very clear to me that whenever I turned on the news, a whole lot of input came into the present moment that was not helping my life move in the direction of non-doership and non-attachment to outcomes. The news was telling me about a whole lot of things that when I pressed the button and turned the news off, was simply not in my experience. So it became very easy for me to switch the news off. I also noticed that there was a lot of advertising that was telling me that you need this in order to be happy. And so while going through this process at that stage, it became apparent to my working mind that I understand that my happiness is not dependent on outcomes, and there are certain inputs that really reinforce the opposite, and then there are other inputs like the spiritual teachings that point me in the right direction. So I figured if this is about me really shifting from one way of being to another, why not turn the news off? And so my head might be saying, no, you shouldn't turn the news off because this is going to give you lots of useful information. If we follow a feeling that includes maybe information from the working mind, then we can find ourselves moving in a direction that we didn't move from. So particularly if you have an appointment and there is a feeling that I don't really feel like doing this. I should do it, according to the shoulds and shouldn'ts, but the feeling inside is that you don't want to do that, you want to do something different. So that's an opportunity to follow the feeling and then see where it leads. And if we start feeling what to do next, then that feeling automatically, or that movement automatically, requires more awareness than when we're habitually moving from our shoulds and shouldn'ts. And to the extent that awareness is in the body, because to feel what to do next requires awareness to land in an area that maybe it hasn't landed before in the body. And so when we make a decision from there, there'll be an outcome. The outcome isn't, this is not saying that if you make decisions from what you feel like, that the outcomes are guaranteed to be positive. This is not some magic solution to get pleasure, pleasure, pleasure in life. This is about connecting to a part of our body that is informing us of what to do on a level that is not the thinking mind. And so to the extent we do that and outcomes are not positive, the awareness will recognize the outcomes. And that will become part of our new conditioning. And next time, the feeling might be different. The feeling of what to do might be slightly different from what it was last time, because the intelligence of the body has now started to see the outcomes. And when awareness is there in such a way that, we're really conscious that I'm making decisions differently, I'm feeling what to do next, then this awareness is particularly present with the whole process, which includes the outcomes. And so patterns start to get seen, and when patterns start to get seen, that becomes more information that the working mind delivers into the system. So this is the intelligence that I'm talking about. It's not just feeling and having, I'll just do I'll become flighty and just touchy-feely decision-making. There's an intelligence that includes the working mind that comes when awareness starts to land and become more aware of things on a level outside of this thinking mind.
Could you explain the difference between the feeling informing us, not guiding us, or is it the same?
So it's usually a thought that informing and guiding is to inform us of information that's assessed. Is that the informing you mean, or?
Sorry, you just said that when we get this feeling that informs us. So I'm asking, is informing the same as guiding in this instance?
Yeah, so once I surrender to the fact that I don't create the feeling arises in a particular moment. I didn't create the thought either. The thought arises, the shoulds or shouldn'ts. What is noticed at some point is they're both happening. So whether I follow the shoulds and shouldn'ts or the feeling, to me it's still destiny unfolding. Destiny that I'm not in control of, I didn't create. But an awareness lands on the fact that when I follow the shoulds and shouldn'ts, which means me definitely still following, I can never really be off track. I'm always, at each moment, in line with destiny, in line with the story of life. But there can be a recognition that when I follow the shoulds and shouldn'ts, it feels uncomfortable. So then we can shift to feeling, and my relationship to it is that this is where God speaks to me in a way that makes me feel in flow. Following the shoulds and shouldn'ts is when God speaks to me in a way that feels out of flow. So it's still God delivering instruction in each moment, whichever way I follow. But it becomes apparent that when I'm following God's instruction as it's delivered in the body, there's a lot more a much more sense of freedom and flow. And so the feeling arises and it guides me, or it drives me, it lives me. It lives me once it becomes clear that that's what I'm going to follow. And so I can say that in each moment, I do exactly what I feel like. And that's been happening for many, many years. Meaning that as soon as a feeling arises that informs me to move in its direction, then I feel like that feeling is living me. Now, that doesn't mean that I have a feeling of hunger arises and that feeling of hunger is going to drive me. It depends on the intensity, it depends on the whole situation. So a feeling that drives me is a feeling that arises in such a form that it actually moves the body to do something. So a feeling of tiredness can arise and it might not move the body to go to sleep, because the overall feeling could be to remain awake. And the overall feeling could be remain awake because the working mind assesses that actually in this situation I have some more work to do, and if I don't do it, the consequence is X, Y, and Z. And even though I'm not attached to the outcome, the consequence is still pleasure or pain. And so the overall assessment says, in this case, even though there is the biological feeling of tiredness, there's also the biological assessment of the consequence of not finishing the work. And so the overall feeling, which is still a feeling, not a should or shouldn't, the overall feeling says, carry on working for a bit longer. The should and shouldn't would have said the same thing. You should carry on working, but from a different place, different attitude. So I would definitely say that the feeling is a guidance.
Very quick. Fear often arises here, and I avoid doing things because of fear. And so I could live in a very small little world and think I'm just doing what I want to do, or following some kind of true feeling. I truly don't want to go out of the house, or whatever. I don't want to get involved in this situation. Mm-hmm. That brings fear. So even teaching this little meditation class, which I think probably does, I don't know, there's a fear that arises about doing it. I don't want to do it. It's hard to discern in that. What's the guidance?
Yeah, so the fear is a feeling, it would be a feeling, and so it's not the feeling that I'm talking about, because it's a feeling that is still linked with the thinking mind. But to the extent that that feeling is really strong, then it's still going to drive, we're going to be driven that way. And at some point, even with this suggestion, there has to be a surrender to that which is that which happens, that which rules in each moment, seeing it as part of destiny unfolding. So to the extent that we take this on as a new set of shoulds and shouldn'ts, I should do what I feel like. And then when we see that we're not functioning from this place of feeling, but still following the thinking mind, which can include the feeling of fear, then if we hold it as a should and shouldn't, we'll start judging ourselves. So the fact is that the mechanics of us moving are still going to be what they are at a particular point in time. And so the thinking mind might be too strong to feel at some point. The whole movement is a movement of starting to become aware of this. And so sometimes we're going to be able to do what we feel from a place that's not the thinking mind. And at other times we're not going to find that that's possible, because the thinking mind is too strong. And if we're aware, if there's an awareness on this this movement, if attention starts to land on it, then there'll be an awareness that, yes, in this moment I'm functioning from my shoulds and shouldn'ts, and a whole inquiry can go into that. Oh, so why am I functioning from the shoulds and shouldn'ts? And then you say, clearly I feel that this outcome in this moment, based on the feeling, this outcome is very, very important. Yeah. That it is my happiness. And so this is not about berating ourselves for this, but just seeing, yes, that's the case. Yeah. And then another moment we can feel that there's a should and shouldn't, and then there's another feeling inside, and the first response might be to follow the should and shouldn't. And no, what I really feel like is staying at home. Not from a place of fear, let's say, but from a place of that biologically I feel like staying at home. And so then we need to honor that if we can. And in that moment you go, yes, I can. And so you'll make the phone call and cancel what you have on. So there isn't exactly a perfect, this is how you do it. It's more about bringing attention to the fact that we function very much from these shoulds and shouldn'ts, these do's and don'ts, and these feelings that arise in the body that are from the shoulds and shouldn'ts, do's and don'ts. And then there's another layer of feeling, which is below those, that is more authentic. So let's reiterate that we can't necessarily access the more authentic feelings straight away.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm kind of seeing what that fear is, and it is an attachment to an outcome, and people need to like me and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, playing it. Mm-hmm. And I'm seeing through that, then there would actually be quite a lot of enjoyment in that particular activity. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. Sometimes we have a feeling that, like, is an addiction feeling of, I don't know, partaking in something, like drinking a bottle of wine. Let's say every night we drink 2 bottles of wine, and clearly we can see that this is not good for us, and yet that feeling arises to do it. And what our experience is that the feeling is so strong that inevitably we do it. And so going with what you feel like actually opens up to the fact that, yes, this is the feeling, this addiction is the feeling, and I can't access any other feeling. So I'm going to run with the feeling, just surrender to the fact that the feeling in this moment is to open up a bottle of wine. The normal chiming in of the thinking mind is to chime in and says, oh, here you are again, drinking a bottle of wine. You shouldn't drink a bottle of wine. It's not good for you. And, you've got no willpower, and so the guilt will accompany this. So to the extent you surrender to the feeling, you might say, okay, in this moment I know this feeling is coming from an addiction, which is an attachment to or doership somewhere deeper underneath the feeling. But that's the fact, that's how it is in this moment. And fighting it is too hard. I've spent my whole life fighting this feeling, and it wins because it's so strong, but in between it winning, I'm struggling and trying to fight it. And then when it wins, I'm judging myself. So we can start moving from a place of feeling, and whether it's a feeling of that's coming from fear and addiction, a feeling that ultimately at its root has attachment to doership and attachment to outcomes and doership in it, surrender and have the bottle of wine. Mm-hmm. Understanding that that's destiny unfolding, and have it with no guilt. Mm-hmm. Because maybe we can see that the guilt is another layer of suffering. The fact is that this feeling, even though it's a psychological feeling, is there, and it's so strong that I'm not going to win. And you might actually find yourself following that feeling and having a bottle of wine like you've never had a bottle of wine before. Yeah. And if we find ourselves surrendering to certain feelings, understanding that yes, that's what's driving me in each moment, either the thinking of the thinking mind, which is psychological, or the feeling, which is also psychological, or this other set of feelings that I'm talking about, which are more biological. To see that whichever it is that's driving us, that's life living us. And there's nothing to feel pride or guilt about. And hopefully if we recognize the others are being lived that way, nothing to blame the other over. And so if that outer layer of guilt falls away, then that is affecting the deeper root from which the guilt stems, from which the drinking probably stems. The drinking may be a feeling that is coming from a deeper uncomfortableness. Mm-hmm. And so to the extent that on the outer level the guilt falls away, it may actually change the root, which then might change the behavior of wanting another drink.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I was just wondering, what about when these two just seem to balance each other out so greatly? Like to take an example from my life, if I would love to just quit my job tomorrow, but the consequences of that would be great, not only for me but for the people that my job supports. But there is just an ongoing feeling I'm super aware of, that is just constantly there. You've got to get out of this. It's just so, you're just a slave to this situation, sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And yet the thinking mind, or even the working mind, is kind of so sure of the consequences of making that decision that I just seem to be stuck in this kind of limbo of the two.
So I'll explain. I'll run through how this unfolded for me, because it's completely in line with what you're saying. One of the big hints is this feeling you're having. You've got to get out of here. You're slave to this situation, right? That's significant in the situation in this example. When it started becoming apparent to me that I was putting in place appointments with friends and clients and whatever, and those appointments, when the time came, were not exactly what I wanted to do. So I'd have a plan to go out for dinner with someone, I'd come home from work, and I'd lie on the couch, and it's the best thing, lying on the couch when you're tired, And then I'd look at my watch and say, oh, I've got to get up in 5 minutes off the couch to go and have a shower. And the feeling inside was, but I don't want to get up off the couch. I want to just be able to lie here for the next 3 hours. And then I'd look at the situation and there was no, but you know, you've got to get up in 5 minutes too. So then 5 minutes came and I said 5 more minutes and, you know, then go and have a shower. So I go and have a shower. And at some point it became clear this internal conflict was not something I wanted to live with. And so in this example, it's quite simple. I started learning how to cancel. So I said, how do I have to live with this feeling, or do I have other options? And it became clear that in each moment there are options. Options that I didn't see when I was living life according to the shoulds and shouldn'ts. And so when attention landed on the problem and says, how can I fix this problem? The solution became very clear, is that you have to change, you have to be able to go with the feeling instead of just go with what's in place. So I called a friend up and said, I'm sorry, I'm really tired and I wouldn't do our meeting justice if I came to see you. And what I thought was going to be a disaster, as in, you know, they're going to be very disappointed, it turns out that they say, oh, I'm really tired myself, this is great. I was feeling like I couldn't cancel. And it was, oh, wow, okay, so I took note of that, not exactly what the thinking mind expected. Then it also became apparent, because I started realizing how very often what I felt like doing in the moment was not aligned with my timetable that I had put in place each week. You know, you accept this and that and that. And the more and more I noticed that what I felt like doing in each moment wasn't in line with the timetable, then it became apparent I can't just keep cancelling all the time. I've learned how to cancel now, but it's not the most ideal. It still doesn't feel nice to cancel. So then I found myself saying, well, I'm actually going to live more spontaneously. And so if someone said, would you like to go out for dinner on Friday night? I'd say, well, I'm sorry, I don't know. Because it was true, I don't know how I'm going to feel on Friday night. And this is what I had neglected in the past. I figured someone asks me to go out and it's sort of theoretically Friday night, dinner, friend, that's a yes, isn't it? In the head, it's all good. So it'd be yes, I'll say yes to that. Friends say, so shall we go and play golf? You know, same thing. Golf, friends, Saturday morning. Yes, it's a yes. And then when Saturday morning comes, I didn't realize I was going to be out till 4:30 in the morning and get home with an hour before I had to wake up to go to golf. So when I said yes, it seemed like a great idea. In practice, it wasn't a great idea. So realizing that I'm never going to be able to forecast how I'm going to feel at a particular point in time, I just decided, okay, I'm not going to schedule my life. I'm going to do what I feel like in each moment, which is going to mean I can honor this feeling without having to keep canceling things. And then this awareness on the difference between my plans and feeling, the awareness that going there and also becoming more familiar with what I felt like doing, that sort of started to get more and more refined. And it started to move into more and more areas of my life, making more and more decisions, not from the old way, but from the new way. And so inevitably some friendships would fall away, some ways of looking after the house changed. So the thought is, you know, when I finish dinner, I should wash the dishes. At some point I go, I don't feel like washing the dishes. So then it's like, okay, so I won't wash the dishes. Now, And then I found I wake up in the morning and, actually now I feel like washing the dishes. So the dishes still got done. They didn't necessarily get done according to the plan previously. Previously, the dishes got done, but not when I felt like it, when I should do the dishes. Now, we have to be, this might not suit other people in the household. This is something that can be very tricky to work out what the final balance is, and it's true that this can create some upset around the way, but it's worth it because it really takes us to a place of functioning that is far more natural than what has been put in place. And so as I started seeing the gap in more and more areas of life, at some point my job became the topic, and it was very clear that I didn't feel like waking up when my alarm clock told me I needed to wake up, and I didn't feel like going into work most of the time. So once life had... Now, this is, hopefully at the end of the story you'll understand the theme or the principle that I'm trying to put forward. I'm not suggesting that everyone say, well, I don't feel like going into work either, and so Roger said I should do what I feel like and not go. It's very specific to, this is a very personal journey of refining what is appropriate for you in your circumstance, given your makeup and the story of life. So really the story of life is going to do the refining. And the story of life is throwing out some new conditioning that can become part of that process, this experiment, if you like. So having changed in many other areas of my life and seen a great result, the principle I had in mind was, well, actually I can't not introduce this into any area that feels out of balance. And so at some point the job came up, and I had enough, practice and skill and confidence in this shift that it was time for me to apply it on the level of work. But I knew that if I don't go into work, I'm going to lose my job. And if I lose my job, then I have no income coming in, and I had certain fixed costs, a lot of them having to do with accommodation and lifestyle. And so when I looked at it before doing anything, I thought, let me look at this in an objective fashion. And I thought, how could I live if I don't have an income? And I looked at my lifestyle and compared it to this feeling inside, and I thought, actually it was very clear from a long time back when I started this experiment, what is most important is the end of internal suffering. That was my priority. And so many of the other things were circumstance or outcomes, pleasure. So it became very clear that there's the level of outcomes and then the level of internal suffering. And I switched, took the outcomes off the pedestal, which is what was on the pedestal, and I put the end of internal suffering on the pedestal. And I was very clear that the end of internal suffering is the priority, and outcomes is a low second, a distant second priority. Which meant I understood that if I cancel something, there could be an outcome. That is, my friend might not be my friend anymore. I said, well, that's unfortunate. Well, maybe unfortunate. It's an outcome. And I was willing to suffer the consequence as long as I was honoring the new priority, which is the end of internal conflict. And I found that doing what I didn't feel like was creating internal conflict. So then I said, I have to do what I feel like. So looking at this, before doing what I feel like in relation to work, I had to think about it. And the conclusion was, okay, I'll live in the forest where I don't have to pay rent. It's not really legal, but I figured one person in a big forest, I'll make it work one way or another. And in Australia, there was a social security system, which meant I could get some basic things. And if I was living in the forest, then the income I was getting would be more than enough for food and some whatever basics, some clothes and that sort of thing. And the more and more I thought about it, because I thought, okay, you can't just say you're going to live in the forest, because then at some point you're going to be in the forest, really. And is this feasible? You know, if it got to minus 30 in the forest, it's not feasible, let's say. So anyway, I looked at the options, and my dad had an old caravan, so I asked him if I could borrow the caravan. He said yes. And I contemplated what would it be like waking up each morning out of a caravan in the forest and all this. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, this is great. This is going to be brilliant. This is actually not a sacrifice in a sense. I've always liked being in nature. I've liked camping. I haven't minded roughing it a little bit. And so I thought, and then I'd have to, showers and things like that. And so I figured every couple of days there's a walk, a few kilometers or whatever, find some public showers or something. And you'd have to walk into, and I'd say, well, I don't have much to do in my days anymore. So walking to the shops will actually be interesting. Walking to the showers, interesting, yeah. And the rest of the time I'm sort of living in the forest. And I really, for a month, I really imagined this situation as accurately as I could. And at the end of it, I thought, this is an adventure. This is going to be great. So once it became, I was ready. I went out. I bought knives and forks and glasses and plates and mattress for inside the caravan. So it was fully ready to be taken out into the forest. And so this was the big breath. The next morning, or before I went to sleep, I unplugged my alarm clock. I thought, I'm going to wake up when I wake up. And so the next morning I woke up, maybe about 10 minutes after the alarm clock would have woken me up. So I was still in time to actually go to work, which was a little disappointing in a sense. But I said, okay, but I'm going to do what I feel like. I don't feel like going into work, even though I woke up without the alarm clock blaring in my ear. I don't feel like going to work. So I said, well, this is it. This is the time. This is the moment. And so I didn't go into work. And then after I was probably an hour or two late to work, I thought, let me ring up reception and get them to transfer my phone to my mobile phone. So this was in the 2001, I think. So we had mobile phones, and the internet wasn't what it is now, obviously, but we still had the system of being able to transfer our phone calls from work to our mobile. So I did that, and I started getting some phone calls from clients. I was working as a stockbroker at this time. Then some clients were giving me some orders, and I thought I can ring them in to work and see how that goes. But then I realized, there's a night system that allows me to put orders in at night for the next day. And so I started using that. It was on the internet, but it was fairly rudimentary. And I was able to take orders for about 60% of my clients were doing things that I could do on this night system. And so for the ones that rang up that I couldn't do it, I sort of told them to ring a friend of mine, and they became clients of this other guy. And anyway, so 6 weeks later, I needed something from my desk. So I walked into work and went up to my desk, and my boss sort of was walking past, and he saw me and he said, "Where have you been?" And I said, I've been working from home. And he said, oh, okay, carry on, and walked off. And so I thought, great. I went into work not knowing, I hadn't spoken to anyone for 6 weeks at work. It's sort of job that, it was sort of autonomous, that let you do your own stuff. But you had to meet certain, financial requirements. Otherwise, you were a cost to them instead of adding profit. And so my things had shifted where I was sort of just above the threshold that I needed to be. And so I had this caravan ready, but I never actually needed to take it out into the forest because my business carried on in a way that I was quite happy with. I could work from home, take calls in between that I was doing other stuff, and the business actually got stronger and grew bigger. And the way that I was dealing with these particular clients that I was still able to deal with changed, and it changed for the better. It meant I had more time to focus on them and what they really needed. And so my business actually got stronger than it was when I was in the office. And so the point here is that what we think will happen doesn't always turn out. And sometimes what turns out is much better than we actually expect. So, once again, this is not about telling everyone to stop work. It's a very personal process that will unfold exactly as it's destined to unfold. And it may not be destined for someone to stop working. What might happen is that just an attitude shift means that the work that you do, or the same work, can be experienced differently. Maybe it isn't possible for that work to be engaged in a way of peace because life is trying to push you. Not trying to push you, life is always unfolding, but it might create this tension in order for the tension to be the reason to do something differently. What we often don't realize, because we don't understand that we have these options, is that you really could find another job. You could look for another job and get another job. There are other jobs in your sector, in your field. If someone is holding a gun to your head and telling you to go upstairs where they know you've got some money, it could surprise us to just stop and say, actually, in this moment, I have options. In this moment, I'm free to do whatever I want. There's a gun to your head, and the guy's saying, take me upstairs to where the money is. You start, in this moment, I'm free. I can say yes or no. Thinking mind might say, you're not free in this moment, you've got a gun to your head. But the reality is, I can say yes or no. And if I say yes, we could go upstairs, he gets the money, and he could shoot me. And if I say no, he could look at me and go, what do you mean no? No. And he might run out scared. Like, oh, it's the wrong place for me to be. And similarly, if I say yes, we could go upstairs, he could get the money and everything will be fine. He leaves and all that's happened is I've lost some money. If I say no, he could shoot me. We don't know what the outcome is going to be in any of these situations. Now, this doesn't mean that because I've accepted that I have options in this moment, it doesn't mean that I'm going to say no. In knowing I have options, I might look at the fact that there's a gun to my head and say, yes, we'll go upstairs. So the important part is to see in each moment there are options and to look at those options. Because the thinking mind doesn't allow us to see options, it just says, this is your only option. So to see there are options and to, just to see there are options, I can do it differently. And if that feeling gets strong enough inside, the feeling that says, this is not what I want to be doing, that could be because there's a sort of, the diversion divergence happening because we're following these shoulds and shouldn'ts. And the more we follow shoulds and shouldn'ts, the more we're believing in the fact that what I am is the doer, what I am requires outcomes. And that's a false set of beliefs. When it's in place, it's going to feel uncomfortable. And so the more that we follow that set of rules, the more we confirm that these beliefs are accurate. And the more we confirm these beliefs are accurate, the stronger they get and the more uncomfortable we feel.
Thank you.
You mentioned destiny again quite a few times, and it's I like the sound of destiny. It doesn't bother me. It's just that I don't know how I'd really know that it was the truth.
The destiny is the truth.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a good point. Because really it's just a concept that I'm putting out, right? Yeah. And what we tend to do as humans is we hear something, someone tells us that all of life is destiny. And then our tendency is to hear a concept and either believe it or disbelieve it. And often, because someone in a certain position tells us something, then we go, yes, well, that's how it is. You know, our parents tell us a lot of things and we believe it. So the notion that life is predetermined, which is one of the concepts in this teaching, life is completely predetermined from the beginning of time to the end of time. And whatever happens in each moment is a happening according to God's will. That a leaf falls off a tree at exactly the time it is destined, based on the story of life. And the path that the leaf takes to get to the ground is exactly the path that is destined, according to the story of life. Nice story, this idea of destiny. But is it true? The teaching is a set of concepts, and we shouldn't take it to be truth. So your question is very pertinent, because it's a recognition that it's a concept and it's not necessarily the truth. When we look at the opposite concept, that to predetermination, the opposite concept, or at least what it's opposing, what the concept of predetermination is trying to oppose, is the belief that I am the doer, that I am in control. And when we investigate that, we can investigate it and very quickly see, no, I'm not. So we can put a definite cross next to the concept, I am in control. If we were in control, everyone would be perfectly happy. No one would ever suffer. Everyone would have what they want because they're in control. And the fact is very, very obviously that we're not in control of what happens in life. And when we look at it, we find we're not even in control of how my heart beats, not in control of the thoughts that arise, which I've assumed to be my thinking, because the thoughts that arise when on close investigation is an output of the biological instrument, an output of the brain, and the brain is a machine designed to function exactly the way it functions. So if the brain gets sick and damaged, then a whole lot of faculties change. Some motor movements can change, memory changes, and even the way that we think can change. So we can see that the thinking is not my doing, but a product of this machine that is designed a particular way. So we don't need to call it broken or unbroken, but it just is the way it is. And so the thinking happens, and then after the thinking happens, behavior happens, movement happens, speaking happens. And we say, oh, all of this is not in my control. It happens according to the circumstance I'm in, and the circumstance is not in my control. So I've talked about destiny, and at some point the thought arose, is this true? Is destiny truth? Now we relate to that as my thought, or you relate it you relate to it as your thought. Actually, it's a thought that arose according to the circumstance, which was me talking about destiny, and according to your makeup. If I was talking about something else, a completely different thought would have arisen. Not because you chose to think a different thought, but because the reaction of a thought arising would be different. And so so we come to see, oh, I'm not in control. I'm not the controller of what happens. Everything is a happening. And when we look at it further, we'll see that the thought is a result of factors that came before. So we could say your thought is predetermined by factors that came before it. Or your thought is determined, so we'll get rid of the pre for now. Your thought is determined by factors that came before. So in that case, if the factors that came before were the determinants of your thought, and you didn't control the factors that came before, then you could say your thought is predetermined. And if your actions are a result of thoughts, then you could say your action is determined by factors or functions that came before. So I can say my movement, my behavior is predetermined to be what it is. And so if we go far back enough, we'll see everything is determined by what comes before in each moment. So the whole of life is an unfolding that was essentially predetermined at the initial impulse. If there's a factor in life that is not mechanical, if there's a factor that is separate and independent, then the idea that everything is predetermined falls apart, because there is this entity that is not affected by things that come before, if that entity exists. But the fact is, when we investigate, there is no entity that is independent of everything that came before. No entity on a biological or psychological level. So it's very hard for the doer. The doer believes that it is an entity that is independent. When we find out what the doer is a set of beliefs that come from the brain. So the doer itself is something that is determined by that comes before. So the thought that says, I am completely independent and unaffected by anything, is quite clearly an object that is completely affected by everything that comes before. So the brain is conditioned by everything that comes before. The output of the brain is dependent on the brain, and the brain is dependent on all of the factors that came before. So if it becomes clear that life is essentially mechanical, or physics, if we want to put it in broader terms, life is physics and thinking is part of physics. And the doer is actually part of physics. The belief in doership is part of this whole mechanical thing. So if we take the example of dominoes all laid out in a spiral, very complex domino games that you can set up. And as soon as you tap the first domino, in theory, the last domino has already fallen. It's just a matter of time for the whole spiral thing to unfold. And then in that system, there's a domino that falls, and it tips a little bucket out, and a ball rolls down a ramp and hits another, of the dominoes, and the sequence then carries on. It's very complex. And let's say somewhere in this complex chain, 2 dominoes are spaced at a distance that's too big for the domino to hit the other domino. And so if that happens, the whole unraveling stops. And it's clear that it was predetermined for that stop to happen even before the first domino was set in place, or before the first domino was hit. So it's not that the predetermined story has suddenly gone wrong when the dominoes stop. It's that what was predetermined was for that to happen. That's one way of looking at life as destiny. From another perspective, if it becomes clear that life is an experience arising in consciousness, that what seem like objective realities are actually being experienced. Which means, in this moment, if you freeze frame, if you freeze the situation, do we know that this is not just a frame arising? That it's just it could be just an image, like a big poster, and the 3-dimension is just apparent. So if we look at a poster, there can be a poster that is 2-dimensional, but designed to appear 3-dimensional based on the drawing. So you take a photo, and a photo can look 3-dimensional because of all of the objects that create the appearance of 3-dimensional. Could it be that when we look at life, life is not what it seems? It's an experience created to appear to be what it's experienced as.
Like a film, you mean?
Like a film, yeah. Included in the experience are all of the feelings and thoughts and emotions. So not just a visual film, but a multi-sensory experience. Very much like a dream at night. A dream is a multi-sensory experience of time and space. So a dream world arises, and when you're in the dream, when the dream is being experienced from inside the dream, it's very much like life. In fact, from within the dream, we get so scared because it's completely like life. And when we wake up, we see, the dream was just an experience arising in consciousness, recognized by consciousness. An experience that isn't fundamentally real, or it's real as an experience, but the world that was experienced was not fundamentally real. How could it be real? It existed in consciousness, that we can't go and find the setting that was the dream. It doesn't exist, we can't go out and find the hills and the seaside and whatever the setting of the dream was. It spontaneously arose in consciousness and collapsed in consciousness. And so if life delivers certain recognitions of the nature of life, it can deliver the recognition that life is an experience. And if life is recognized as an experience, just like a dream can be recognized as an experience, once we're looking at a dream theoretically, we see it's just an experience. And so then we can say that the dream unfolds according to destiny, or according to the story of the dream. That the character in the dream is destined to be wherever they are in the dream at whatever point in time, that it's destined for, a dog to come up and start licking the character's hand according to the dream, according to the story of the dream. So from within the dream, if the character realized that they are in a dream, they would say, whatever happens in each moment is destined according to the dream. So if the character woke up and realized, the character would only realize it's a dream because it's part of the dream. The character doesn't have any independent capacity to realize it's a dream. The realization it's a dream is part of the dream. And so if in the dream there is a realization it's a dream, when something happened in the dream, when a bird flew across the horizon, the character would say, this is a dream, and that bird is not a separate independent entity, just like I'm not a separate independent entity. That bird is flying across the horizon exactly as it's destined to fly across the horizon. It's flying across the horizon according to the creation, according to the dream. And the character would also, because it's part of the dream, realize that the thought that says this is all a dream is also predestined as part of the dream, because nothing can exist outside of the dream. So if life, as we know it, includes a recognition that life is experience, it can include the concept, and it can include agreeing with the concept that yes, life is a dream, life is predetermined. Now, if life doesn't deliver that realization, that doesn't prevent us from seeing life as a happening. It doesn't prevent us seeing life as a predetermined story. It just means that it has to be seen as a predetermined story using different logic. The logic that everything is physics unfolding. That what I do in each moment is based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. My genes and up-to-date conditioning was a result of everything that came before. And whatever functions after is not in my control and predetermined by this movement of life.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, trying to word it. It's about the kind of conflict that goes on. So say about the feeling in the morning of, I really don't want to get up, I'm tired, so I want to just lay in bed. And you want to follow that feeling. And then the working mind is saying, no, you're going to be late for work, it's going to put you under pressure, you're going to be rushing, and there's this kind of toing and froing, but you go with the feeling. Then you go with the feeling, and then afterwards you're really angry at yourself because then you're rushing for work, you're tired, you've made yourself really stressed for the rest of the day. So it's like there's just that conflict, and it keeps repeating over like every day. And you can never really come to a resolution, because on one level you're following the feeling, but on the other level, there's the knowing that that's not really bringing you happiness, but yet it keeps repeating.
Mm-hmm.
And how to break that, and what's, is a continuous conflict.
So what you described wasn't my experience of doing what I feel like. So when I did what I felt like, it was feeling in that moment the totality of what that moment was saying. And so if I understood that I had to go to work, and the feeling was, I just want to lie in bed, I would do what the overall feeling told me to do. So if we look at one part of the feeling only, like the biological feeling, the tiredness, then we might only be looking at one part of this overall feeling that I'm talking about. And so if we look at one part of the overall feeling, then we're always going to be in conflict, because one part of the overall feeling is not the complete feeling. So the biological tiredness, when we sit with the whole feeling and see, what do I really feel like in this moment, will include the working mind. You said the working mind. I'm not sure if you meant the working mind or the thinking mind.
Yeah, I don't know. I suppose it's a bit of both in a way. But yeah, it's the working mind knowing that it's not going to bring you ultimate satisfaction by staying in bed, but the thinking mind kind of saying you should get up. So it's kind of like you're...
Yeah, so the thinking mind says you should get up. The working mind says if you don't get up, there's going to be a consequence. It doesn't say you should get up. It just says, the working mind says, if you don't get up, there is a consequence. The thinking mind says you should stay in bed, or it says you should get up. The thinking mind just tells you what it thinks you should do. And to surrender for a moment and just feel, what do I really feel like? And if for example, you have a family that you love, and you know that if you don't go into work, you're going to lose your job and everyone's going to be out on the street, you might realize that that consequence is not acceptable to you. And so instead of saying, well, I feel like lying in bed, the realization might be, actually, overall, I feel like going into work. Because sure, on a biological level of tiredness, I feel like staying in bed. But what I really also feel like is making sure that my family has a roof over their head. And so the overall feeling could be, actually, I feel like getting up and going into work. If we just look at the biological, we're always going to be saying, oh, I feel like staying in bed, but I have to get up and go to work. So if we realize why we're going to work, I'm going to work because, not because I think my happiness is to be found in outcomes, but because I want my family not to be on the street. Not because I don't think that we should or shouldn't. And so there's a lot of technicals in this process. Once we start to learn. It starts to get refined. So, we might have been told you shouldn't put your hand on the hot plate, right? And so we go around saying, I shouldn't put my hand on the hot plate. Maybe not even knowing why I shouldn't put my hand on the hot plate. If you actually say, I'm going to drop this idea of I should or I shouldn't put my hand on the hot plate, I'm going to see. And then what happens is we touch the hot plate and touch it, and ooh. And so you get your own realization of this. And then it becomes clear, I don't touch the hot plate, not because I shouldn't touch the hot plate, but because I don't want to touch the hot plate. So this difference of should and shouldn't versus not wanting to is also important. So when we look at going into work and we have a family, and it's like, I'm not going into work because I think I should go into work. I'm going into work because I want to go into work, because I don't want my family to be on the street. And if we start looking at it that way, then we see that there's a feeling of tiredness. There's the feeling of, I don't want my family to be on the street. The two together will give us an overall feeling. Right? And we follow that overall feeling. The overall feeling might be, stay in bed. That could be the overall feeling. The overall feeling might be, I'm tired, but I want to get out of bed. And in my experience, once I followed that, and if the overall feeling was, I want to stay in bed, what it's saying is that my want for my family to have a roof over their head is less than the feeling of tiredness. And so without saying, well, that's a good feeling or not, I will do what I felt like. And 10 minutes later, the feeling might be, now I want to get out of bed to go to work. So I'm not exactly sure that this sounds particularly clear, because it probably sounds like there's a lot of conflicting things. Like, on the one hand, you're saying you don't want your family to be on the street. But on the other hand, you're saying the overall feeling, even not wanting the family to be on the street, is I want to stay in bed. So let's explain that. There's the biological feeling of tired. It has a certain volume. there's the I don't want my family to be on the street. It has a certain volume. And those two volumes are both, let's say, on the biological level, not on the psychological, not I should, and just there. And then the overall feeling is the mix of those two together. And so if the tiredness is at volume 100, the overall feeling is stay in bed. And so what I personally did was I followed that. It became my rule to do what I feel like and then see what happens. And so the seeing what happens is, let's say then I get a warning at work. That I then realize, wow, I got a warning. And when you get a warning, it really sinks in. My family could well be on the street because I've got a warning here. And so then when you're tired next time, the new information that happened when you did what you feel like is part of the system. And so you get this feeling, I'm tired, but then it's really clear, no, these other factors are there. And so I feel like getting up.
I think maybe the problem is the thinking mind that's saying you should and then rebelling against that because, so maybe, if the thinking mind isn't there, there would be, like you say, the biological, or there would be one or the other too, but in a way it's something about the thinking mind saying you should get up, so it's like you don't want to do what you should do, so you kind of...
Yeah, that's what it is.
What I
It's
mean?
a conflict between shoulds. And my experience was when I drop the shoulds and just go with the biological feeling and allow them to balance and give me a final feeling, my mantra was, I'm doing what I feel like because the other way I know doesn't work. Do I feel like? And then I knew the consequences will be what they are. So if I did it and I lost my job, then I'd say, okay, well that was the consequence. I accept that this way of living is going to have consequences, like any way of living will have consequences. And we learn from those consequences. It just means, okay, it was destiny for me to do what I feel like, destiny for me to lose my job. And now what do I do? Now I have to find another job.
So it's really, in this scenario, it's kind of like really seeing actually the thinking mind is the problem and it doesn't really have a place because it's actually never bringing you resolution in a way.
Yeah, it doesn't bring resolution. At least this way, you surrender to doing what you feel like. You accept the consequences, which are actually only pleasure or pain, not an attack on your happiness. And in my experience, the consequences didn't turn out to be catastrophic. In fact, starting to do this delivered very good results, especially on an internal level. And surprisingly, on an outcome level, I can't say that the outcome suddenly became really bad. The trick is to start practicing on decisions that maybe have less impact and start introducing this in relation to things, smaller issues. And as you start to see the subtleties, then there's a confidence to start applying this to bigger and bigger decisions.
Because the shouldn'ts of the thinking mind are basically saying that you're the doer, aren't they?
Yes. And that outcome is much more than it actually is. So outcome is either pleasure or pain, and the thinking mind is saying, I'm the doer, and the outcome is the most important thing. And the surrendering into what I feel like doing is actually saying, it's taking the outcome off the pedestal and saying, on the pedestal is dropping into feeling into the body, which is dropping out of the thinking mind essentially. And what that's affirming is that my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. My happiness is to be found by knowing myself. And so this dropping into the body is where we come to know ourselves. We don't ever know ourselves in our head. So when I drop into the body, I can start to feel, and the sense of I am is found in this plane of the body. So that's really another of the reasons why this movement is important. It takes us out of our head into feeling, and the junction point of impersonal consciousness and the body is in the heart, and that's where the sense of personal consciousness arises from. It's where the sense of I am can be found, in the body, where impersonal consciousness of source links to the body and functions as personal consciousness. So the spiritual heart is the gateway between, or the bridge between the personal and the impersonal. And at the point where the two meet is this sense of I am. And we know ourselves when consciousness drops into the body and starts to feel in the absence of thinking. Okay, what's next?
It's just just to follow up quickly on that. I don't know why, but some people get up early because they've got to go to work early. But I get to sort of have a lay in if I want most days. But I find that for some reason, that I just want to get up early, because even though I can lay in and have more sleep, I tend to not. I tend to get up because I think I don't want to miss the best, the morning part. And just, and then sort of when you get to sort of 11 and that, you sort of miss the best part of the morning and the day. So I don't know whether that's because that's me being the doer and saying, no, you're going to miss the day. So maybe I'm stopping myself from resting a bit more when I've got the opportunity to do that. But I seem to just get, sort of every morning, I've been doing it for years, I seem to be getting up earlier than I need to.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like a habit, or maybe. And I probably could do with some more rest to get rid of, like niggles and aches and pains and things, but I just seem to be always, just want to jump up.
Yeah. So if we start going into a lot of detail, it starts to become very tricky to answer these questions, because this topic is important for me, because I found that at some point I realized I wasn't living in my body. I wasn't feeling anything in my body, and I was following all of these shoulds and shouldn'ts. And so the shoulds and shouldn'ts reinforce or are part of the idea that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. When we look at this whole teaching, it says, what are we really looking for? We're looking for happiness for the human being. Human beings have been seeking happiness in outcomes for their whole life, thinking that that's where happiness is to be found. It turns out that happiness is not at all to be found in outcomes. Happiness is to be found in our attitude to the flow of life. An attitude that just allows life to be as it is, sees it for what it is without judging it, without getting involved in it. And so feeling what to do is something that, in my experience, I found I was not aware of. And when life is allowed to be as it is, then that means I can just allow the feelings to be there. So that means to hear that there is a place of making a decision from that's in the body could be completely new information to someone. And if that new information brings awareness into the body and allows us to see that our current way of thinking is simply not allowing life to be as it is. And so we might realize, wow, I'm tired in the morning, but my head says you should get up because you're missing the best part of the day. And we might not even realize that we're being forced out of bed based on an attachment to the best part of the day. And so it can become apparent that my thinking mind is obstructing a more authentic way of allowing life to unfold.
Thank you.
I don't really know if I've got a question, but it's really nice to have heard what you were saying, because it sort of makes sense. Although I go with the flow. I feel like I'm much more instructed by the feel of my heart, the feel of my body, and than I ever have been. And it's really lovely. I feel like very grateful. It's a great way to live. I never used to be a very fit person. I was a very sedentary person, really. But I get this lovely feeling to run or to, take exercise, to swim or something, and I do that quite strongly. And I think it's something to do with helping me not go into the shoulds and shouldn'ts, or not go into fear or something, I don't know, but really using my body now. And anyway, long and short of it is, I think it's been a slow, gradual, 20-year thing, because I'm an artist, so I've never had to get up. I mean, I had to be an artist. I'm not one of these shoulders really at all. But I did do the thinking minds with relationships, I think, and I'd stay in relationships that I felt I should be in out of duty, and that's sort of part of my training, I think, part of my patterns. And anyway, about a month ago, it just was. Oh, I don't really want to go into the story, but I just fell deeper into this, and it's been really lovely. The flow is incredible. I feel like I'm on the edge. I used to love taking drugs. I stopped taking drugs a long time ago, but I loved taking drugs because I felt that I was on a roller coaster and I had no control, and I could just flow with life. And that's how this feels. It's been feeling like this for about 2 years, but strongly now. And life's getting... things are becoming much more authentic, and it's becoming faster and faster and faster. And one of the big things that's changing is relationship I've been in for 17 years, where I've had a child and stuff. And some information came up, which has basically put me in a situation where it's really, really obvious I just don't want to be in the relationship anymore. And it does feel... I know it's destiny as well. I know that I've got no control. I know I'm not a doer. But I also know that I am a doer, and that things like exercising and staying in the flow is really, really important while this gets dealt with in a kind and loving way. And I mean, I don't know. I suppose the question is, I feel like I have one little bit of choice, which is how deep I go into my heart with it. So us deciding to get divorced and that sort of thing, I was so deep in my heart, so full of love and so kind, that I barely had to... I watched my mouth move and barely had to say anything. And he is quite an angry person. I mean, bless his heart, he's just a fiery guy. And normally he would have got very fiery. I could see him wanting to, but he was in the flow too, and we just went into the flow of it. And I feel like I'm going back to sort everything out in America. And I'm telling myself I have a choice. I can either go into the shoulds and get really discombobulated, or stay in this flow. But staying in this flow means I'm not going to be living in that house anymore, which is fine. I'm not going to be married anymore. I'm not going to be mothering most of the time, half the time. It's quite a big consequence staying in this flow. And I'm not scared, and it feels great. I'm so happy. I can't believe it. But anyway, I don't know. Just saying that. I know there isn't really a choice, but it feels quite nice to know just stay deeply within this gift that I've been given, this deeper connection to my heart. And anyway, that's what's the consequence of going with the feel. It's quite big right now.
Yeah, there are consequences. The consequence of not going with it is this growing uncomfortableness that at some point becomes unbearable, and that's when we do something about it. And then once it forces us to that point, often we can say, what took me so long? So life either pushes us where it becomes unbearable, or life empowers us with making decisions from this new place slowly, where we become more and more confident that we can take it into more and more places of our life. And in a way it's the same thing, because once we become really confident to take this into different places of our life, when we realize that we haven't taken it into a certain place in our life, the feeling is so unpalatable that we feel the only option is for me to take it into this area of my life too. And it does mean that a whole lot of things need to get unraveled, and that can be awkward and painful, inconvenient. But life has a tendency of bringing new things in. And those new things can actually be better. And so we end up, one, with the freedom of that uncomfortable feeling inside, and inevitably a lot of these circumstantial problems get dealt with. We need to, life often brings in new circumstance. But it doesn't change the fact that these changes are sad sometimes and painful. This is where it becomes very important to make sure that the right objective is on the pedestal. Because if we don't have the right objective on the pedestal, if we're still putting outcomes on the pedestal at the top of the list, then we don't make the change.
Yeah, that's what's helpful. It's really solidified it, and it sort of helped me see it, as it were, because that is absolute number one. And it's I'm going to just make all the decisions like that, all the different decisions that need to be made in the next few weeks. Yeah, well, they don't need to be made. I'm just going to flow with it,
Say that again?
They're not really decisions that need to be made. They're just me flowing with decisions that, anyway, it's hard to describe.
And so this choice that we feel we have, so I would say this choice happens in each moment. And so if, the choice of how deep into our heart we go, I think that's the choice you said that you feel you have. It often feels like when a choice is made, it feels like I chose it. That's how it feels. But when we look at it, there'll be a day when, let's say, you find you can't go deep into your heart. It just, it's just, there's no access there. The fear is too strong or something. And then on another day, we find, wow, I'm really connected deep inside, and the circumstances or the consequences, I'm not thinking about the consequences. I understand them. I've had a look. My working mind has had a look, and now the feeling is so clear of what to do that the consequences are really secondary. And so on that day, it seems like I have the choice. I've chosen to go deep into my heart. Just like, a drug addict can one day find that they give up drugs. They hit rock bottom and they find the motivation to give up. But why didn't they give up if they feel that's my choice? Why didn't they give up 3 days ago, or 3 weeks ago, or 3 years ago? Because even that feeling like I have the choice to go into my heart or not go into my heart is also, in my way of seeing it, a happening. It happens in the moments it's destined to happen, and it doesn't happen in moments that it's not destined to happen. And to the extent that we find that it is starting to happen often, where we remember, maybe if we're not in our heart, the thought arises, drop into your heart and make a decision from there. When we see that happening more and more, then we can be grateful that life is taking me to a place where the default is to make a decision from my heart.
Just could you repeat again? What was the thing to have on the pedestal when making these decisions? You mentioned about having a particular view on the pedestal.
Yeah. So what goes on the pedestal, at one point when this inquiry started happening, it became very clear that what was on the pedestal was outcomes. So I was following the shoulds and shouldn'ts because I thought if I do this, I'll get pleasure, I'll get love of the other, or I'll get the outcome that I want. And in following those shoulds and shouldn'ts, following that strategy, I also started to feel this internal discomfort with living life that way. And once it became clear that there was a gap between what I felt like doing and what my shoulds and shouldn'ts were telling me to do, once I noticed there was a gap and that gap was the uncomfortableness, it became very clear that I had to take the outcomes off the pedestal, and I had to put my peace of mind on the pedestal. And when peace of mind was on the pedestal, it became clear that now I need to let go of attachment to outcome. That's actually what taking attachment to outcome off the pedestal meant.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
So yeah, on that same theme again. So I left my job 2 years ago now, and it was partly because my health wasn't good, and that my soul felt really bad in that company. I was really fed up. But I got a package because there was a joint venture with another company, so I had money for some time. And strange enough, when the money became really, really gone almost, I realized that I had some stock options left, so I had some more time to work on myself. So far, it did work out amazingly well. And it was a terrible decision for me to make. I mean, it felt my whole soul wanted out, but my mind was screaming, no, you're completely crazy, you have to stay. So yeah, I did follow that. But now the money is running low again, and I have an interview with another company, which is also a big corporation, so I'm projecting similar things as to my previous one. And again, there is a survival instinct which is saying, you know, you have to get that job. There are projections which are saying it's a, you know, bloody corporate job again, back into the hamster wheel and all of that. And there's something in the middle that's not clear, like perhaps I would like to go back and try again, working in a corporation and seeing if actually I can live things differently, I can feel things differently. But there is so much confusion regarding this job. I'm not clear whether I should take it, or if I do take it, if it won't be unbearable. I mean, it's just...
So this is the problem with talking about this topic, because it moves a little bit away, because it's indirect, talking about doing what you feel like. It's indirect, well, it's directly linked to attachment to outcomes, but it also starts to get into personal circumstance and make it sound like personal circumstance is the reason for my happiness. It starts to sound like that. And so then we start wondering, well, what should I do? Should I take the job or shouldn't I take the job? And that's when it's time to remind that this discussion still has to fit into the overall discussion that says, actually, life will unfold exactly as it's destined to unfold. There's not a single moment that is not as it is destined to be. And destiny means pleasure sometimes and pain at others. It also means, for many people, suffering and not peace of mind. For some people, destiny is for there to be peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance that we find ourselves in. So it can be a bit confusing. It says, this seems like what you're talking about is circumstance, because whatever I do, whether I do it from my heart or my head, is just going to lead to circumstance. And really, when we look at it, it's not. It's about an attitude of how life lives us, or an attitude of what is important. Now, having said that, there isn't an answer as to how you should live your life. The teaching doesn't tell you how you should live your life. It's not even saying you should do what you feel like instead of doing what you think or feel to do. It's a set of concepts that describe that if we make decisions from our shoulds and shouldn'ts, then we're probably still making decisions from a set of beliefs that say my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And starting to do what we feel like, to me, is not doing what I feel like because of outcomes, but doing what I feel like because of what the feeling tells me in that moment. The outcome is not in my control. So my suggestion is that in each moment, do what you feel like doing, and once you've done that, sit back and see what happens.
Yeah, but in this particular case, that's the problem, is that I don't really know what the genuine feeling is. I don't know what I really feel like. It's like screaming voices contradicting each other.
But you won't know what you feel like when you're listening to screaming voices. Because screaming voices are in the place where you can't feel. So in order to feel, you have to drop into the body and feel. Now that doesn't mean that you can feel today what you are meant to do tomorrow. What it means is feel what you're meant to do now. And do that. That means, like right now, the decision about your job may not be relevant. So do what you feel like now, And now do what you feel like. And now do what you feel like. And now do what you feel like. And before you know it, you'll be doing what you feel like for your whole life.
And then when the interview comes, then...
Well, you may or may not have accepted the interview, but you don't need to know whether to accept the interview now. Now you just need to do what you feel like.
Thank you.
So, thank you.